My dad taught me self-defense since I was a child. 3 days after my wedding, my husband swung at me. I didn't think twice. I fought back, and he ended up in urgent care. People keep asking if I froze, if there was a beat where I decided. I understand why they ask it that way. It's the version that makes sense to them, where a woman has a choice and either takes it or doesn't. But there wasn't a moment. There wasn't a decision. My body did something my mind hadn't caught up to yet, because my dad had spent the better part of 15 years making sure it would. I was 7 the first time he took me out to the backyard after dinner and told me to get up from the ground without using my hands. I thought it was a game. He'd roll a tennis ball at my feet and tell me to fall. Actually fall, not the theatrical collapse kids do when they're pretending to be shot, but a real drop. Weight going down through my hip instead of my wrists. Roll onto the meat of your shoulder. Don't brace with your hands. You'll break a wrist trying to save yourself from a fall that wouldn't hurt you at all. I didn't understand any of it as anything other than something we did together. While my mother did the dishes inside and my older brother sat on the porch pretending to have forgotten his homework. By 10, he'd moved to wrist escapes. By 12, hip throws. The kind you learn on a mat, except we didn't have a mat. We had the strip of grass between the shed and the fence, and he was teaching me from memory things he'd picked up over 2 decades working corrections outside Knoxville. Things he'd seen go wrong for other people in ways he didn't elaborate on, and I didn't ask him to. I asked him once, maybe 13, why he never taught any of this to my brother. We were on the back steps, a beer sweating in his hand, and he thought about it longer than I expected. Your brother's a boy walking through the world, he said finally. You're a girl walking through it. Different world, same feet. I didn't understand what he meant. I nodded like I did, the way kids do, and went back to whatever I'd been doing. It would be 18 years before I understood it fully, and by the time I did, I was 31 years old, on the tile floor of a kitchen that had been mine for exactly 3 days, listening to a sound I had never heard another human being make. I want to tell you about that sound, about the punch that never landed and what came after, because the after is the part that actually matters, the part where the story tries to eat itself and very nearly succeeds. But first I have to tell you about a man named Grant, who I married in a barn outside Asheville with string lights overhead and my father crying quietly in the front row, like he already knew something the rest of us didn't. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about the moment your body defends itself. It isn't really about that moment at all. It's about every quiet, patient afternoon that came before it, all the way back to a man teaching his daughter how to fall. I met Grant at a conference in Charlotte, the unglamorous kind of trade show that fills a convention center with company polos and laminate samples nobody wants but everyone takes. He worked sales for a manufacturer out of Greenville, booth 2 rows from mine, a laugh that filled up more space than his body did. He found an excuse to walk past 4 times the first day. On the 4th pass, he asked if I'd had lunch, and when I said no, he said neither had he, like that settled something between us that hadn't existed a minute earlier. What I remember most isn't any single gesture. It's the accumulation. He texted good morning every day without fail, even from a layover once. A photo of an airport pretzel captioned, "This made me think of you," which made no sense and made me laugh so hard I left a meeting. He planned dates 3 weeks out, which felt like proof I wasn't just a way to pass a Tuesday. My friends called him a catch. I'd had 2 relationships before him, both of which had fizzled from something closer to boredom than any real rupture, and Grant didn't simmer. Grant showed up. 6 weeks in, he told me he loved me over dumplings, said it like it had just occurred to him and he couldn't hold it in. I remember a small flutter of alarm alongside the flattery, a voice asking, "Isn't this fast?" And I remember dismissing it because everyone told me I overthought things. There was a night, 4 months in, when I mentioned an ex in passing, nothing dramatic. Grant went quiet in a way I hadn't seen, not angry, careful. He asked a handful of specific questions and then let it go so completely that by morning I'd half convinced myself I'd imagined the strangeness of it. I didn't have a category yet for the kind of man who needed to know exactly how much of you belonged to him before he could relax. I'd develop that category later, with a great deal more data than I wished I had. Grant met my parents that Thanksgiving. He was, by any measure my mother would use, perfect. Complimented her cooking specifically instead of generally. Asked my father real questions about corrections and listened to the answers. Helped clear plates without being asked twice. My aunt asked me twice, unprompted, if this was the one. My father shook his hand a beat too long at the door, and again when he left. I noticed both times and said nothing. What was there to say? A handshake. Later that night, I found my father alone in the kitchen doing dishes he didn't need to do. A rag in one hand and a glass he'd already dried, turning it under the light like he was checking it for something. "What did you think?" I asked. "He's polished," he said, which from my father was not automatically a compliment. "Is that bad? Watch how he talks about people who tell him no," he said, not looking at me. "That's all. Just watch that." I asked what he meant. He didn't have a clean answer. Something about a co-worker Grant had described at dinner, someone who'd pushed back on a sales strategy, and how Grant had outmaneuvered him. Told the story like it was funny. "He talks about himself like he's already won something," my father said. "I want you to notice that." Generally. I told him he was being overprotective. I was 30. What I didn't tell him was that I'd started noticing things too. The way Grant kept a mental ledger of who owed him what. The way any disagreement eventually became about how I'd made him feel, until I was the one apologizing for having had an opinion. I filed it under normal friction. My father never brought it up again. I wish the lesson had taken before the wedding instead of after. He proposed the following spring, on a hike land with a precision that in retrospect should have told me something about how he approached everything, including people. A ring that was, he told me, exactly what I would have picked myself if I'd had the vocabulary to describe it. I was moved by that, by the sense of being truly seen. We did premarital counseling because my mother asked. The counselor had us do an exercise about money, about what our families had modeled. Grant talked about his father, a man who'd made unilateral financial decisions for 30 years while his mother found out after the fact how much he hated that model. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I hadn't fully clocked as a knot until it started to come undone. We agreed out loud in front of a witness whose entire profession was watching people make and break exactly this kind of promise, that anything above a certain threshold would be a joint decision, not a courtesy, made together before the money moved. I believed him completely. It would be easy now to tell this as though I'd seen through him from the start. That isn't true. The wedding came together over the following year. A barn outside Asheville, string lights, 60 guests, a handful of Grant's co-workers from the Charlotte office, including a woman named Renee, who I'd meet properly only once at the reception, and who would matter a great deal more to this story than I could have known. Cash gifts and gift cards filled the registry faster than we expected. We'll figure it out together, Grant said easily when I joked about it, echoing the language from counseling. At the time, it felt like proof the promise had stuck. If you'd watched the wedding video, and I still have it, you'd see a man who cried during his vows and held my face like I was something he genuinely couldn't believe he'd gotten to keep. 60 people who loved us both, standing when we were pronounced married, meaning the applause. You'd never guess what was coming. Nothing in the footage gives it away. My father's toast was short. He said something generic, and then he looked at me, specifically, not at Grant, and said, "You know how to take care of yourself. I made sure of that a long time ago, but I hope you never have to." People laughed, assumed it was a joke about independence. I understood what he actually meant only much later. Grant's toast was polished the way everything about him was polished. He talked about the dumpling restaurant, the 6-week mark, framed now as charming impulsiveness instead of the thing it had actually felt like at the time, which was too fast, an alarm I'd since learned to mute. He thanked my father for raising, in his words, a woman who didn't need anyone but chose him anyway, and the room ate it up and I ate it up too. We danced our first dance to a song that had tested well with both families, the kind of compromise you make 100 times over the course of a wedding without ever noticing you're building a habit that will need to hold up under much worse conditions later. Grant held me close and said, low enough that no one else could hear, that he'd never felt like this belonged to him before. Not a house, not a job. This, me. I held on to it for a long time after, even after I understood exactly what it had meant when he said belonged and meant it literally. We left a little after 11, sparklers, my mother crying, my father hugging me longer than the moment called for. We drove to the apartment we'd already moved into that spring, married now, exhausted, happy in the bone-deep way that only comes from a long day finally ending the way it's supposed to. Neither of us could have told you we had 3 days left before any of this cracked open. The first 2 days of the marriage were exactly what you'd want them to be. We slept late, ate leftover wedding cake standing at the counter, opened cards on the couch, and set the checks and gift cards in a growing pile that we eventually transferred into the top drawer of the guest room dresser, telling ourselves we'd deal with the joint account paperwork once the wedding fog cleared. By my count, we'd received a little over $4,000 in cash and checks, plus several gift cards, the largest a $600 card from my Aunt Carol, who'd written that she hoped it would help us make the new place feel like ours. On the morning of the third day, I went looking for that gift card. A stand mixer I'd wanted for 2 years was on sale until that afternoon. It wasn't in the drawer. I checked twice, moving the checks and cash aside. Neither, I realized on the second count, was about $1,100 in cash I was fairly sure had been part of the original pile. Grant was in the kitchen, still in the shirt he'd slept in, eating cereal standing up, scrolling his phone with his free hand. I asked casually if he'd moved anything from the drawer. He didn't look up right away. When he did, something had already shifted in his face before he'd said a word, a kind of stillness I hadn't seen on him before, the sound of a decision being made somewhere behind his eyes before his mouth caught up to it. "I used some of it," he said, "for the truck payment. I'll put it back." I didn't feel rage. I felt a small, specific confusion, the kind that comes from reality failing to match a promise you'd trusted completely. "You used the wedding money," I said, without telling me. "We agreed. It's our money, Dana. It's our money we agreed we'd decide on together. In counseling. Out loud. That was 3 days ago. You didn't even wait 3 days." He set the spoon down harder than the moment required, a small controlled violence meant to communicate something before any words did. "Don't do this," he said. "Don't turn this into a thing." I didn't hear the tone underneath those words yet, the way I'd hear it later, once I understood how many times he'd used that exact phrase before, on someone who wasn't me, in a fight that had nothing to do with a gift card. I heard it the way you hear a familiar phrase from someone you trust, an ordinary request to de-escalate, not the opening line of a script he'd already run once. I had an old, worn smooth instinct to smooth things over, to not be the wife who makes a scene 3 days into a marriage. I actually opened my mouth to say something conciliatory. What came out instead was, "You don't get to decide that unilaterally, and then tell me not to make it a thing." He crossed the kitchen fast, faster than I had ever seen him move, and he swung. I didn't decide to fight back. There wasn't a moment where I weighed my options. My body simply did what my father had spent 15 years putting into it, back in a yard I hadn't thought about in years. I turned into the movement instead of away from it. I caught his wrist mid-arc instead of eating the punch, turned my hip the way I'd been taught, redirected his own forward momentum into the floor instead of into my face. He went down onto the tile hard enough that his ribs caught the corner of the lower cabinet on the way, and he made a sound I had never heard a person make before, and then he just lay there, one hand pressed to his side, staring up at me from the floor of our new kitchen like I was the one who'd done something inexplicable. I called 911 with my hands shaking so badly I had to try the passcode twice. The shaking wasn't fear. Everything in me was still switched on, still primed for a threat that had already resolved, with nowhere left to go. 2 officers arrived alongside the paramedics and separated us, one staying with me while the other spoke to Grant in the kitchen. I sat on the couch in my pajamas, 3 days married, answering questions about my own wedding gift cash as though it were evidence in a crime, which I would come to understand it was. At urgent care, Grant told the nurse he'd fallen. It might have stayed that story if the physical evidence had cooperated. It didn't. A fractured rib from a fall doesn't usually pair with bruising that reads, to a doctor who's seen both real accidents and stories dressed up to look like them, as defensive rather than incidental. When the physician pushed, Grant's story changed. His wife had attacked him, out of nowhere. It wasn't until 2 days later, when an officer called about a follow-up interview regarding a restraining order petition Grant had filed against me, that I understood, not the other way around. That took a full 10 seconds to process. I had assumed, without deciding to assume it, that if either of us walked away with paperwork against the other, it would be me. I had the bruise forming on my own forearm. It hadn't occurred to me the story could invert this completely, this fast. The petition described an unprovoked assault, volatile, someone he now feared being alone with. It requested I be barred from the apartment we'd signed the lease on together 4 months earlier. I sat on the floor of my parents' guest room and did something I'm not proud of. I doubted myself, not the facts, those I remembered with total clarity. What I doubted was whether the facts would matter, whether the person who moves fastest just gets an institutional head start that has nothing to do with what actually happened. My father came in that night, arms crossed, and when I got to the restraining order, his jaw tightened in a way I'd only seen a handful of times in my life. We're getting you a lawyer tomorrow, someone who does exactly this. I don't care what it costs. I asked if it would matter, given how far ahead Grant already seemed. It matters, he said. It always matters. It just takes longer than it should. I lay awake most of that night, trying to find the version where I'd done something differently, where it could have been avoided if I'd just let the gift card go. It took embarrassingly long to arrive at the truth. A man doesn't cross a kitchen at that speed with his fist already closing over a missing gift card, unless something in him had already decided, long before the gift card, that this was a door he'd go through. I hadn't provoked someone into becoming a stranger. I'd been the first person to open the door on someone who was already there. My cousin had used an attorney named Priya Desai for her own divorce and hadn't stopped recommending her since. I called the next morning, expecting a 2-week wait, and got Priya herself 20 minutes later. She was sharp in a way that felt like competence rather than performance. When I finished walking her through everything twice, she set her pen down and looked at me directly. "This is going to be fine," she said. "I need you to hear me say that, and I need you to actually believe it, because the next few weeks are going to feel like the opposite is true, and I don't want you making decisions out of panic instead of strategy." The hearing would happen within 2 to 3 weeks. Grant had already retained counsel, a firm, Priya noted with a flicker of distaste, that specialized in exactly this kind of aggressive early filing. The physical evidence would matter, the officer's report, the bruising I'd had photographed at Priya's insistence, but none of it would be dispositive on its own. Cases this contested, this word against word, often came down to credibility, pattern, corroboration from anyone who'd heard even a fragment of what had happened. The problem was there wasn't much to be found. We'd married into an apartment where we didn't yet know our neighbors. I moved out that week into a short-term rental Priya's office helped me find. I remember standing in its small living room, surrounded by 3 boxes of hastily packed clothes, feeling embarrassed, like leaving was itself the wrongdoing, simply because I was the one who'd had to do it. I called my father most nights that week. He didn't say much, mostly stayed on the line while I talked myself in circles. "You didn't do anything wrong. This isn't going to be the whole story, even if it feels like it right now." I believed him more than I believed myself. It was the second week on an ordinary Tuesday that gave no warning it was about to matter, that Priya called with something that changed the shape of everything. Her name was Marisol, and she'd lived in the apartment directly below ours, close enough that her kitchen window looked out onto the same narrow courtyard. I'd said maybe 6 sentences to her total in 4 months, hallway pleasantries, a shared complaint about the elevator on move-in day. I wouldn't have picked her voice out of a crowd if you'd asked. She called Priya's office directly, having tracked down the firm's number through the property manager after officers canvassed the building. She'd heard the whole fight, not just the crash, because it was July and her window had been open and sound in that courtyard traveled. Priya had her come in 2 days later to give a formal statement and asked if I wanted to be there. I said yes, mostly because I couldn't stand waiting at home for a call telling me secondhand whether a stranger believed me. Marisol was younger than I'd registered in our hallway exchanges, nervous in a way that read as genuine rather than performed. She'd heard raised voices, then a man's voice saying, "Don't turn this into a thing," in a tone she described, unprompted, as practiced. Not the tone of someone improvising in the heat of an argument, the tone of someone who'd said those exact words before and knew exactly how they landed. She'd heard a crash. She'd actually called down to the front desk before I'd even reached my phone, worried enough by the sudden silence after it to want someone else checking. Then she said something that made Priya go very still. The phrase had struck her as familiar even in the moment, she said, because she'd heard a man say almost the same words in that same courtyard, roughly 6 weeks before our wedding. A different argument entirely. A voice she was now fairly confident, having heard it again through the same window, belonged to Grant, arguing with a woman who was not me. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. She'd never have connected the 2 moments at all if the second argument hadn't ended in an ambulance. I sat in Priya's office and felt something shift under the floor of the whole ordeal. Relief I hadn't let myself feel once in the 2 weeks since since the incident. It wasn't just that someone had heard the fight. Someone had placed a pattern. Grant hadn't lost control in a single unrepeatable moment. He'd said those words before to someone else in that same practiced tone, months before he'd ever put a ring on my finger. Priya walked me out afterward, and standing in the parking lot in the last of the evening light since the petition had been filed, I let myself believe this might actually be over. That a stranger's open kitchen window, of all things, might be the thing that saved me. I was wrong about how much it would take. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like, though, because it felt completely like the reveal. Like the truth had surfaced whole, and all that remained was for the system to catch up. Grant's attorney, a man named Whitmore, filed a response within the week that methodically took apart everything Marisol's statement seemed to promise. A single overheard phrase, he argued, common enough in ordinary speech, proved nothing about pattern or premeditation. Marisol's identification of Grant's voice from an argument months earlier, one she hadn't reported at the time, hadn't been asked to remember until officers came knocking after a far more serious incident, was retroactive pattern matching of exactly the kind courts were rightly skeptical of. Memory is suggestible, he wrote. A witness told a phrase might be significant will often find it significant in memory, whether or not it originally was. I watched Priya's jaw tighten reading that filing, not because the argument was unfair exactly, but because it wasn't entirely wrong. Marisol's recollection, uncorroborated by anything except her own memory prompted by a police canvas, was not the same as a document. It was still, however much it had felt like the whole truth 2 weeks earlier, fundamentally circumstantial. The hearing was continued rather than resolved, pushed back 3 weeks, and the continuance landed on me harder than the original filing had, because I'd let myself believe, briefly and completely, that the worst part was already behind me. It wasn't. It was a different, quieter kind of waiting, made worse by knowing there was a woman out there, unnamed, unreachable, whose own experience with Grant might hold the key to everything. I spent those 3 weeks doing the thing Priya had specifically warned against, making decisions out of panic rather than patience. Some nights I tried reconstructing Grant's life before me from whatever public digital trail existed, looking for a name to attach to the voice Marisol had heard. I found nothing. Grant had always been careful online in a way I'd once read as professionalism and now read as something closer to discipline, a man managing his own record. I remember one night, alone with my laptop open to a search bar, feeling a doubt that was different from the earlier kind. That earlier doubt had been about whether the world would believe me. This one was quieter and worse, about whether I'd become someone I didn't recognize, sitting alone at midnight trying to dig up a stranger's trauma as ammunition, and whether wanting to survive this justified becoming that person. I called my father that night and told him some version of the fear. He was quiet a long moment before he answered. "You're not digging up anything," he said. "You're trying to find someone who might need to hear she's not the only one. If you find her, that's not a weapon. That's a favor you'd be doing for a stranger, whether or not it ever helps your case at all." I held on to that reframing harder than I probably should have in the weeks that followed, because it was the only version of what I was doing that let me keep doing it without hating myself for it. The break, when it finally came, didn't come from anything I did. It came from a procedural quirk of the system itself, the kind of unglamorous administrative mechanism that never makes it into the version of these stories people tell at dinner parties, but that ends up mattering more than nearly anything else. Priya called on a Thursday morning, her voice carrying a note of contained energy I hadn't heard from her since our very first meeting. "The county attorney's office," she explained, ran a standard cross-reference on contested restraining order petitions once they reached a certain threshold of dispute, checking the petitioner's name against prior filings, prior incident reports, anything in the system that might bear on credibility. It was routine. It was meant to catch exactly the kind of pattern that had, until now, existed only as an unprovable phrase overheard through an open window. Grant's name returned a hit. 8 months before our wedding, a woman had filed a police report against him after an argument that had ended, according to the report, with him shoving her hard enough that she'd struck a door frame and bruised her shoulder. The report described the argument as originating over money, specifically over funds Grant had moved out of a joint account she hadn't known he had access to. Without telling her beforehand, she had not pursued charges. She had, according to a brief note in the file, described herself at the time as not wanting to, in her words, blow up her whole life over one bad night. The woman's name, when Priya finally said it out loud over the phone, meant nothing to me directly, but it matched precisely a name I recognized from the wedding guest list, one of the small handful of co-workers Grant had brought from the Charlotte office, a woman I'd spoken to exactly once at the reception, over a plate of appetizers neither of us had finished, a brief and forgettable conversation about how nice the venue was. I sat with that for a while after Priya hung up. The idea that a woman had stood in the same barn, under the same string lights, watched him marry me, and had already lived through some earlier version of exactly what I'd just survived, was almost too strange to metabolize all at once. I kept returning to the appetizer conversation, trying to remember anything in her face that might have given it away, and finding nothing, because of course there was nothing to find. She'd learned, presumably the hard way, exactly how good he was at compartmentalizing one part of his life from another. Priya's office reached out to her carefully, through her attorney rather than directly, respectful of the fact that she had every right to decline any involvement in a case that wasn't hers, and had nothing to gain by wading back into it. I didn't expect her to say yes. I would not have blamed her at all if she hadn't. She got in touch with Priya 3 days later and said she would talk to us. Not because she owed me anything, she said, in words Priya relayed to me afterward, but because she'd read what had happened to me, the parts of it that had become part of the public record through the continuance filings, and she recognized in painful, specific detail the shape of her own worst night reflected back at her. We met at Priya's office on a Monday afternoon, the four of us, myself, Priya, the other woman, and her own attorney, a quiet man who mostly listened and occasionally clarified a date. I won't use her name here. It isn't mine to spend. And she asked, gently but clearly, that whatever came of this stay contained to what the legal process required and not spill further than that. I've respected that ask in every telling of this story since, and I'll respect it here. She brought a folder with her, thin, carefully organized, the kind of folder someone assembles slowly over time without initially knowing what it will eventually be for. Inside were screenshots of text messages between herself and Grant from the weeks surrounding the incident in her own police report. Messages she'd saved not out of any premeditated plan to build a case, but simply because, in her words, something in her had known even then that she might need them someday and hadn't been able to explain why. The first screenshot was a message from Grant, timestamped 2 days before the incident in her report, telling her he'd needed to move some funds from their joint account to cover an unexpected expense. I'll put it back before you even notice, the message read. Just don't make a whole thing out of it if it comes up. I read that line and felt something go very quiet and very still in my chest, a stillness that wasn't about calm at all. I'll put it back. Don't make a whole thing out of it. The same shape, almost word for word, as what he'd said to me standing at our kitchen counter 3 days into our marriage, over a gift card and $1,100 in cash. Not a fight born from a uniquely stressful week. Not a man who'd simply lost his temper once. In an isolated moment neither of us could have predicted. A script, the same beats, the same phrasing, the same casual assumption that money moved without permission would only become a problem if she chose to make it one. The second screenshot was from the night of the incident itself. A longer exchange, escalating, her pushing back on his explanation, him responding with increasing coldness, and then a final message, sent after the shove the report described, after she'd apparently locked herself in a bathroom to call a friend. You're going to blow this whole thing up over a bruise that'll be gone in a week. Think about what you're actually accomplishing here. Priya laid both screenshots flat on the table between us, next to a printed copy of the incident report from my own case, next to a transcript of Marisol's statement about a courtyard argument and a familiar practiced phrase. For a long moment, nobody said anything at all. It was Priya who finally spoke, and what she said has stayed with me longer and more clearly than nearly anything else from that year, because it was the moment the whole shape of the story I'd been living inside finally reorganized itself around something I could actually hold on to and use. It wasn't a temper, she said, looking at the documents rather than at either of us, the way she looked at things when she was thinking out loud rather than performing for a room. He didn't lose control with you, and he didn't lose control with her. He ran the same play twice, and this time there's a paper trail he can't explain away. The other woman, sitting across the table with her hands folded tightly in her lap, nodded slowly, like she was hearing her own worst night described accurately by someone else for the first time since it happened. I used to think it was my fault for making him feel cornered, she said quietly. I don't think that anymore. I didn't say anything for a while. I was thinking about a phrase my father had used months earlier, standing at the sink with a rag in his hand. Watch how he talks about people who tell him no. I hadn't understood that night that I was watching the opening move of something that had already been rehearsed on someone else. I understood it now. Sitting in a conference room with a stranger's phone screenshots laid out like evidence in a trial neither of us had asked to be part of, and the understanding didn't feel like relief exactly. It felt like the floor beneath the floor, like discovering that what I'd thought was the bottom of this story. Back in Priya's office 3 weeks earlier, listening to Marisol describe a phrase overheard through a window had only ever been a landing on the way down to something much more solid and much more damning. The rescheduled hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in a courtroom smaller and less dramatic than anything I'd built up in my head over the preceding weeks. No gallery to speak of. A tired-looking bailiff, a judge named Hargrove, who had, according to Priya, presided over more of these hearings than either of us could imagine, and had developed, as a result, a low tolerance for theatrics from either side. Whitmore, Grant's attorney, opened by trying to keep the focus narrow, confined to the incident itself, the kitchen, the tile, the swing that hadn't landed, and the takedown that had. He argued that Marisol's courtyard recollection remained uncorroborated speculation, and that the other woman's prior incident, never formally charged, never adjudicated, was irrelevant character evidence being smuggled in to prejudice the court against his client. Judge Hargrove allowed Priya to respond, and I watched her lay it out with the same unhurried precision she'd used in her office weeks earlier, except now there was documentation behind every sentence instead of just an account. The officer's incident report from the scene, describing Grant's initial fall story and its collapse under examination, my photographed bruising, timestamped the day after, Marisol's formal statement, and then entered as evidence over Whitmore's objection, which the judge overruled after a brief and somewhat pointed exchange about the relevance of demonstrated pattern in domestic cases, the screenshots. Grant's own words, in his own handwriting, sent from his own phone, 8 months before he'd ever raised a fist toward me. I'll put it back. Don't make a whole thing out of it. Timestamped, verified, matched almost exactly to language Grant had used with me in a kitchen he'd sworn, in his own petition, he'd never raised his voice in. It wasn't a witness's memory anymore. It wasn't a phrase that could be explained away as suggestible recollection prompted by a police canvas. It was a document, Grant's own words, preserved by a woman who'd had no idea, when she saved those messages, that they would ever matter to anyone but her. I watched something shift in Judge Hargrove's face as Priya walked through the parallel, not dramatic, nothing you'd catch if you weren't watching closely, ugly, but real. A recalibration. The moment a judge who has heard 1,000 contested accounts finally has something solid enough to stand on instead of two competing stories, she has no way to fully verify. He hadn't lost his temper with me. He'd run the same play twice, 8 months apart, on two different women who'd never met before. A hearing forced their stories into the same room. And this time there was a paper trail he couldn't explain away. The judge denied Grant's petition. She took less than an hour to do it once both sides had finished. And when she read the ruling, she didn't editorialize, didn't lecture, simply stated the legal basis in the flat procedural language these things require, that the petitioner had failed to demonstrate the elements necessary to sustain the order, and that the pattern of conduct now in evidence weighed substantially against the credibility of his account. Then she looked up from her notes directly at me and asked if I wished to file a petition of my own. I looked at Priya. She nodded, small, the kind of nod that says she'd been hoping I would ask before she'd have to suggest it herself. Yes, I said. I filed for divorce 11 days after the hearing, which meant I filed for divorce a little over 5 weeks after the wedding, a timeline my mother still struggles to say out loud without her voice catching, as though the calendar itself had committed some kind of injustice against me, independent of anything Grant had actually done. My father drove 4 hours the night the hearing wrapped, arriving well past 10, and found me in the kitchen of the short-term rental, the same kind of kitchen, tile floor, and hard cabinet corners that I'd started flinching around without fully realizing it. He didn't say much when he came in. He sat down at the small table, put both hands flat on its surface, and looked at them for a long moment like he was studying something in the grain of the wood, or in himself. I taught you that stuff so you'd never have to use it, he said finally. Not so you would. I didn't have a tidy response for that. I still don't. Not really. What I had, sitting across from him at that table, was the strange, unearned weight of having survived something using a skill he'd spent 15 years building into me on the off chance I'd need it, and the accompanying grief of understanding that the need had actually come, that the backyard afternoons hadn't been a game after all, that he'd known, in some quiet, fatherly way I couldn't fully access until now, that the world he was preparing me for was real. Grant eventually took a plea deal on a reduced charge tied to the kitchen incident. Anger management classes, a modest fine, no jail time, a resolution that frustrated me for about a week until Rhea reminded me, gently but firmly, that the goal had never been punishment for its own sake. The goal had been documentation. A paper trail wide enough and solid enough that if he ever did this again, to anyone, the next attorney wouldn't have to build a case from scratch out of overheard phrases and a stranger's saved screenshots. The divorce itself went through a little over 6 months later, uncontested in the end, once Grant's own attorney apparently advised him that fighting it would mean reopening the entire restraining order record in discovery, exposure he had no appetite for. Marisol and I are real friends now, not the hallway nod kind we'd been before. I told her months later over coffee how much that open kitchen window had meant, how it had felt in the moment, like the whole truth surfacing all at once, even though I understood by then that it had only been the first floor of something with several more beneath it. She shrugged it off the way she shrugs most things off. I've been the person nobody believed before, she said. I wasn't going to let it happen twice in one building. I think more than almost anything else from that entire year about the other line my father gave me. Years before any of this, sitting on the back steps with a beer sweating in his hand. Your brother's a boy walking through the world. You're a girl walking through it. Different world, same feet. I used to think that meant being ready for a stranger in a parking lot, some faceless danger arriving from outside the life you'd built. I didn't understand, until I was 31 years old, that sometimes the world you have to be ready for is the one you let into your own kitchen. The one who cries during his vows and means it, probably, in whatever limited way he's capable of meaning anything, for exactly as long as he's getting what he wants. My body only ever had to catch up to what my father had already been teaching it, patiently, for 15 years, in a strip of grass between a shed and a fence, long before either of us knew exactly why.